everyone, it's Steph. How are you? I'm here because somebody asked a question about buttercream, and it's a whole lot to type out, so I thought that I would answer it. I know I haven't been live in the group lately. I've been a little under the weather for the past month and a half, for the past 6 weeks, been a little down and out physically. So I apologize if I start coughing in your ear. I've got water here, so. Also, allergies are really bad here today. Like the wind has kicked up over the past couple of days, and I don't know if you've heard about California, and like they're doing like roaming like power outages for people to like prevent wildfires. So it's kind of crazy here. Let me find Catherine's question. So she asked, Stephanie, can you go over the difference in buttercreams, and can I use a sugar substitute in a cooked buttercream? So, oh, and she says here, because I asked her what kind of sugar substitute she's thinking of, and she said monk fruit, stevia, or erythritol. So Catherine's keto. So it sounds like she's trying to make a keto buttercream, which I totally get because buttercream is life. So there's a million different kinds of buttercream, right? So buttercream is basically anything that is mixed with a fat and sugar and ends up creamy and then is intended to frost a cake, right? So a lot of people make buttercream with butter, but vegan people make buttercream with like, shortening or like another like oil-based spread like palm oil or canola oil that's been hydrogenated so that it's solid. You cannot make buttercream with just like a liquid oil. That won't work. Like you would just end up with the soup and it would not frost a cake. It would surround the cake like a moat. So there's 3 primary kinds of buttercream, and there's actually a million kinds of buttercream, right? Because like people do all sorts of stuff and they call it buttercream. But essentially it's a solid fat at room temperature, so it's softened, and sugar, and then some other stuff added to it, and they're mixed in any number of different ways. So there's American buttercream, and there are many different kinds of American buttercream as well. There's like weird hybrids, but your typical American buttercream is basically butter and powdered sugar mixed together with maybe a little bit of cream or a flavoring or coloring to thin it out a little bit and give it the texture and color that you want. So I personally don't like American buttercream, because I feel like it's kind of chalky. It can be exceptionally sweet because like a big part of what's holding it together is powdered sugar, right? And I'm sure you've been to Safeway or Kroger or whatever your local grocery store is, Fred Meyer, and had like a cake and you like eat the frosting off of it and it's very like gritty. Like it's got almost like a gritty kind of like grittiness to it. And that's also that's a type of American buttercream, and I'm not a huge fan of that. Then we've got the cooked buttercreams, which is specifically what Catherine is asking about. And there's 2 kinds. There's actually a million kinds, but the 2 most common kinds are Italian and Swiss. And so Italian buttercream is where you heat the sugar and water over the stove to a certain temperature, and then you whip your egg whites, and then you pour the hot, the hot syrup into the eggs while they're whipping. And what that does is the sugar in the syrup that you've made on the stove stabilizes the meringue. So the deal with egg whites is egg whites are very unstable. They tend to fall apart really easy. They can be overbeaten and they get kind of cottony, and you can actually overwhelm them to the point where they just go back to being like nothing, right? And at that point, like they don't actually hold any air. They don't really create any volume. They just sort of out, right? So in an Italian buttercream, you're mixing egg whites, and then you're pouring a hot sugar syrup into the egg whites as you're mixing it, right? So the egg whites are mixing, and you're slowly dribbling this hot syrup into it. And what that does is it keeps the eggs from cooking, because what it's doing is it's immediately like dispersing the hot syrup as soon as it meets the egg whites. And the sugar added to the egg whites as they're whipping whips the eggs at the same time, continues whipping the eggs at the same time, and then the sugar stabilizes the meringue so that the eggs actually can't be, I mean, they could be overbeaten, I suppose, but when you're adding that much sugar to a meringue, like the sugar basically solidifies like the bubble structure, and so you can whip them much, much, much longer than you can just a regular uncooked meringue, which would just be egg whites just beaten with sugar added. You can do that. That would be called a French meringue, just adding sugar to egg whites and beating it. And it is more stable than just a regular beaten meringue, which is just egg whites. But you run into other problems with French meringue. It's like a whole other topic, a whole other scientific topic. Then there's a Swiss meringue buttercream. And again, it's made with egg whites. And so the egg whites create loft, and they create kind kind of puffiness, and they give it body. And the egg whites, since they're not sweet, just like in the Italian meringue, the egg whites give that body without adding more sugar and sweetness too. So you end up getting a lot more frosting and a completely different silky texture than you do just with like regular butter and sugar. Right, so with the Swiss meringue buttercream, it's a little different. What you do is you take the egg whites and you put them in a pot with the sugar and you heat them to about 140 degrees, right? So proteins coagulate at about 140 degrees. I think it's like 137 degrees Fahrenheit, where they begin to coagulate and where they begin to denature. And then you can take them all the way up to like 180 degrees, which is where they're just like eggs, right? Where you can like pick up the egg and, blah, 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 and like shake it around, right? And so when you're making a Swiss meringue buttercream, you're mixing the sugar and the egg whites and you're whipping them gently kind of as you're heating them over a double boiler. You never want to heat a meringue straight over the stove because it'll just cook your egg whites, right? Because you're trying to bring it up to 140 degrees, but that like the surface of the pan where the egg whites are in contact is way hotter than that. Like it's very close to the temperature of the burner itself, which could be like 200 and 300 degrees, depending on how hot your burner is and what kind of pan you're using. So you want to heat your egg whites over a double boiler so they're heated slowly and gently, never coming in direct contact with the heat itself or metal that is in direct contact with the heat. And then as you're whipping it gently, you are bringing it slowly up to temperature, mixing the sugar in. And then what you do is you take the 140 degree egg white and sugar mixture and you put it in your mixer and then you beat the holy crap out of it, right? And then it gets really lofty and big. And I personally prefer, of the three, I prefer Swiss meringue buttercream. It has this like silky, beautiful, like it's like velvet on your tongue. Like when I was in pastry school, like we would have to make like wedding cakes and like these big other cakes, and we used, you know, Swiss meringue buttercream for a lot of different things, and you would end up making a lot of it because you didn't know how much you were going to need because we were still learning at the time. So we'd have these like big pastry bags full of buttercream at the end of the day, and we would be back in the dish and we'd be back there washing our dishes with these huge things of buttercream. When the chef wasn't looking, we would literally be like, "Gah!" and like squeezing the piping bag full of buttercream just into our faces and down our throats, and it was just like mass diabetic sugar coma. And then we'd like go for the rest of the afternoon and do our dishes really fast and go home and completely crash out from a sugar coma. It's a really bad idea. Like the human body is not meant to consume like 1.5 pounds of buttercream frosting at a very quick period of time, as I learned the hard way. But anyway, the Swiss meringue buttercream is also a stable emulsion because you're adding a sugar syrup to the egg whites as they're beating. The sugar is creating more stable bubbles, which then means that you have a much more difficult time overbeating your egg whites. In fact, I'm not even sure that you could overbeat an Italian or Swiss meringue because like I've had to beat the holy shit out of them. Like they're emulsions, right? Like an Italian buttercream and a Swiss buttercream are both emulsions, right? So you're taking liquid water and kind of a liquid, it's like albumin, the egg whites, and then sugar and then butter, right? And then after the egg whites have gotten very lofty in both Swiss and Italian meringues, what you do is you then add the softened butter in small amounts, and then it whips up into this big, beautiful, creamy thing, right? And so because you're dealing with emulsions, sometimes that emulsion will break. And in a Swiss and Italian buttercream, the best way to deal with a emulsion that is starting to break is to keep beating it and then to solve the problem that is causing it, right? So when you're making a Swiss buttercream, for example, if the liquids and the fats, so meaning the egg whites and the sugar and then the fats, are not the exact same temperature or thereabouts, like what will happen if one is too cold and one is too warm, your emulsion will break temporarily, right? And then it will continue to remain broken until both of those temperatures kind of via beating come to be about the same temperature, right? So if you add colder butter to warmer eggs, like it's gonna melt the butter, and that's no bueno, which is why you wanna cool off your meringue like to almost room temperature before you add the butter. Because if you melt the butter when adding it to a buttercream, you're kind of out of luck, because it's just, I mean, you could technically still use it, but it's not going to have that same beautiful creamy texture. In some cases, it might even have difficulty coming back together. But if your egg whites are just a little too warm and your butter is just a little too cool, if you bring them together, they're not going to mix it first, and they're going to be like, blah, you know. And like a lot of people I've seen mention this in the group, I made a Swiss meringue buttercream and it didn't come together, and I'm sad. And it's actually totally normal. What you have to do is you have to keep beating it, because as you mix the cold butter and the room temperature eggs together, they slowly come to be about the same temperature the more they mix, right? And because that sugar has stabilized the meringue, they eventually intersperse pretty evenly. So it's a really long, nerdy, scientific way to explain buttercreams and emulsions, but it's important to know if you're struggling with buttercream problems, like how they come together and why they may or may not come together at first. So the emulsion, like I said, you're creating an emulsion, and the sugar helps stabilize that emulsion because it stabilizes the egg whites, and temperature is important. So now that I've gone off on this kind of nerdy tangent, let me get back to Catherine's other question. So her question was, can I use a sugar substitute in a cooked buttercream, like monk fruit, stevia, or erythritol? So the reason I just explained all of that nerdy scientific stuff is because I needed you to understand how important sugar is when making a buttercream. So if you're making an American buttercream, there's no real emulsion. If you add milk to it to kind of thin it out, it's an emulsion, but it's not as like detrimental. When you're making a cooked buttercream, such as in Swiss or Italian meringue, the sugar plays such an important role that you can't really swap it out. So you run into problems like on a very like core level as far as like the texture, right? So if you're adding a powder to your buttercream, like if you're having like a stevia powder or Truvia, which is stevia and erythritol, I think, like you're gonna end up with textural problems. It'll get kind of chalky. And you can mix it into the egg whites, absolutely, to kind of get rid of some of that chalky flavor. But the problem is, since there's no sugar, there is no syrup created, and therefore there is nothing to stabilize those egg whites. So for the amount of beating that a Swiss meringue and Italian meringue require to come together, those egg whites are not going to stabilize, and they're going to completely fall apart. You're going to end up with like weird cottony puffs and soup, right? So unfortunately, a lot of sugar replacements and like alternative sweeteners are not going to work. What you can do if you're not going totally low carb is you can try and reduce the amount of sugar that you're adding to your buttercream. You got to be real careful though, because anything in baking is chemistry, right? It's a chemistry experiment. Like cooking, you can be a little of this and a little of that, and whatever tastes good, I'm going to add more of this and less of that, and it can turn out fine. Baking, it is not the case. Baking is very precise. Baking is very specific. This is why some people really enjoy baking and some people really enjoy cooking, and often you'll find that people like one or the other and not both. A person that really enjoys both equally is very rare, right? Because some people are like loosey-goosey, I want to be creative and cook, and some people are like, I'm very regimented and precise and I like to bake because I know exactly what to expect, right? So when you take something like buttercream and you start fudging the ratios, like you run into problems. But you can try, through trial and error, reducing the amount of sugar in your buttercream and then substituting what you've taken out with something like stevia or erythritol or monk fruit, but you're going to end up potentially with textural issues, and you still need to keep enough sugar to stabilize the egg whites. And what you can also do is you can add a little bit of cream of tartar to your egg whites, which will also help stabilize it. I don't remember the exact ratio. I think I remember adding it's like 8 egg whites, and it's like literally like 1/8 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar. The problem is that changes the pH of your eggs, and it can work just fine, but if you add too much, you'll end up with like a flavor, right? Like it's not, like I don't know if you've ever had buttermilk biscuits or something that somebody's added too much baking powder to, or they didn't bake them all the way, and you get that kind of like weird chemical-y thing. That can happen if you add too much cream of tartar to your buttercream, but a small amount can go a long ways towards compensating to a reduced amount of sugar. But the thing is, like when you're making a buttercream, you will never, ever be able to take out sugar completely unless you're adding all sorts of weird emulsifiers and whatnot that are actually going to try and hold the emulsion together, as well as the egg whites, keeping them stable as a meringue. So, and then when it comes to something like erythritol, right? So when you're emulsifying something, I'm going to get real nerdy, so try not to tune out on me. If you're trying to emulsify something, so emulsification generally begins with an electrostatic bond, right? So whatever you're emulsifying, you're adding something to it, something like lecithin. So if you're making like a mayonnaise, and the emulsifier itself will have like some electromagnetic attraction to, or electrostatic attraction to fat, and some electrostatic attraction to liquid, and that's what actually bonds them together. So pH is really important. Sugar, actually surprisingly, which actually I didn't realize this until fairly recently, sugar has a neutral pH, has a pH of 7. At least sucrose, the standard kind of sugar that we're used to seeing every day. So when you're adding anything to a buttercream that changes the pH, either to more of a more acidic side or a more alkaline side, you risk botching your emulsion, right? Because like emulsions are very tricky from a scientific standpoint. Like they are very temperature sensitive, they're very ratio sensitive, and as it turns out, they can be somewhat pH sensitive. So if you're adding something really acidic to your buttercream, it can cause your emulsion to break, and you would potentially need to add like other emulsifiers to hold them together, like lecithin. And then we start getting into like this whole other like conversation of emulsifiers and what is a processed or non-processed emulsifier and how you need to like cook with emulsifiers so that they're not noticeable in your finished product. And if you really want to get into this like topic, you should look into ice cream, because we only had like one classroom day in the whole time, my whole like baking career, and it was the day we did ice creams. The chef had this like whiteboard, it had like charts and ratios, and ice creams, it turns out, are super freaking complicated. So this is a really sort of high level view of buttercreams, how they work, why keto buttercreams would be potentially very difficult to make. It's also important to keep in mind that if you ever see a keto or low carb buttercream on the market, turn that package around and look and see what's in it, because odds are it's held together by something you probably wouldn't want to eat, because it is an unnatural emulsion that needs to be held together by basically culinary duct tape. Also, a word on erythritol. Like, I know a lot of people that are keto are really interested in like being healthy and improving their diets, and erythritol is highly, highly, highly processed. It is not a natural sweetener. Like stevia is more of a natural sweetener, monk fruit is more of a natural sweetener. So I would really encourage you to consider how much erythritol you're consuming. Erythritol is generally made with a form of corn. It's basically you extract some compounds from corn, often highly genetically modified Monsanto corn. I don't know what your opinion is on GMO food. I personally avoid it, and I really have this like deep-seated hatred for Monsanto. It's a whole other political conversation. But if you're eating a lot of erythritol, like I said, I challenge you to really look at what your priorities are as far as processed food and eating things that just because they fit into a keto lifestyle still may not be good for you, right? Like I have a lot of vegan friends, and some of them live on French fries. And it's like, just because it's vegan doesn't mean that it's something you should consume massive amounts of. So they're like, oh, it's vegan, they're totally healthy. Now French fries are not healthy. I don't care. I don't care if there's no animal fat in them. French fries are not a healthy thing to live on. So it's worth revisiting your food priorities. If you're totally fine and you have like cut all other like processed food out of your diet, and erythritol is like the one thing that you consume, and great, go for it. But it's always worth it for me to mention it, because a lot of people aren't aware that some specialized diet ingredients are actually highly, highly processed, and they're simply added into the diet as a replacement for something else that you would normally want to eat if you didn't have those dietary priorities. So it's worth revisiting what is or is not a processed food. Now I've gone off on this total other tangent. Let me see. I have some comments here. Megan says, oh yeah, my kind of subject. Megan, so Megan Liao, she's in our group. She is a totally badass vegan baker. But I'll drop a link to her blog below this, because her blog is Cooking with Caffeine, and she makes beautiful vegan cakes, right, with zero animal products. And I love her work. She does beautiful work, and she's also a lot of fun to read. So she has a lot of really great information to share. Catherine's in here. Megan says, whoa, I had no idea it was electro or anything. Yeah, like emulsions are held together by electrostatic bonds and attraction. And it's why baking is such like a crazy science experiment, right? So this is why I personally love baking, because I'm super nerdy about it. I get really like about it. But some people hate baking because of the exact same reason. So I have to explain that to 90% of the people who buy sweets from me, because I'm a vegan baker. They all think stuff is healthy. No, it's not. Absolutely, Megan, I totally agree with you, right? Just because it's vegan, just because it's keto, just because it's vegetarian, just because it's gluten-free does not mean it's healthy. Like the other day, I picked up a pack of gluten-free cookies, and it was like, oh, natural, gluten-free, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, oh, cool. And I picked it up and I flipped it over and was like, mother effer, there's like 50,000 ingredients in here, and the only one I can pronounce is sugar. Just because it adheres to your personal diet does not mean that it's healthy. So I always encourage people to take a look at what they're eating. Like, dig deep into the ingredients. If you're not sure what something is, if you're not sure where something comes from, read it. Like, you should know where everything that you put in your body comes from. If you're putting it in your body, pause for a second, ask yourself, where does this come from? And if you don't know, look it up. And then you may decide, oh, actually, I don't want to eat that. It's really important to be informed, especially in this day and age, because companies are trying to put all sorts of random shit in our food, and it's seriously not good. I think that's the last question. Catherine, I hope I answered your question now that I've been at it for like 20 minutes talking about buttercream. So go ahead and drop any questions about buttercream below in the comments, and I will try to answer them. And if you're catching this on the replay, go ahead and drop a GIF or hashtag replay below so that I know you were here. Hope I answered your questions. Bye.